Dual containment was the foreign policy strategy of the Clinton administration that maintained a Cold War mindset in 1993 towards Iran and Iraq as an attempt to revise U.S. Middle Eastern strategy after the Gulf War. It was aimed at containing both Ba'athist Iraq and revolutionary Iran, as the name dual containment suggests containing two powers. Regime change refers to a forcible or coercive change in part of or all of a government in a state. It can be internal or external, and each one of these two types has their own subtypes of regime change. Internal regime changes are coups, revolutions, or some kind of government restructuring following a civil war or state failure. An external regime change can be imposed by an invasion, covert and overt means, coercive diplomacy, and other forms of intervention. One key difference between supporting a coup and covert means of regime change is that in an internal coup there are already elements within a state that are going to stage a coup, and the state wanting regime change to occur in another will back that coup, as opposed to covertly undermining a government through black propaganda, staging attacks, creating conditions for a coup, or starting the coup themselves. General impacts of a state that experiences regime change is that there is a lower likelihood for a civil war, as grievances against the existing government have been met with a regime change. There is also a lower chance of a violent removal of the new government and less of a chance of intervening states having open conflict with their adversaries in the region. Additionally, regime change does lower the chances of democratization in a state, and in some cases spawns democratic backsliding. However, there are also cases that go completely against this norm that existed in the Cold War, and there are plenty of examples where regime change occurred and it made things completely worse. Soviet involvement in regime changes dates back to the Russian Civil War, but we're primarily going to be looking at examples in the Cold War. Some internal state regime changes that were backed by the Soviet Union were the 1948 Czechoslovak coup, where the Soviets supported a coup by the Czechoslovak Communist Party and immediately decided that purging was the right way to go. As much as the US gets flack from everyone for staging coups in Latin America, the Soviets kind of saw Africa as free real estate regarding staging coups and covert operations and backing brutal authoritarian rulers. The Angolan Revolution and War of Independence is an example where the Soviets backed Angolan revolutionaries in overthrowing Portuguese rule. An example of a post-Civil War government restructured by the Soviet Union is in North Yemen after they had backed the North Yemenis during the Civil War. A notable post-failed state restructuring attempt made by the Soviets was when they added fuel to the fire that was the second half of the Congo crisis by trying to plunge the Congo into a state of becoming a failed state during the Simba Rebellion. There are many other examples of Soviet involvement for internal regime change, but these are just a few case studies for each type. Some examples of external regime change that were imposed by the Soviet Union upon other states are primarily in Africa, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. Most notable covert means were where the KGB backed the Italian Red Brigades and other Marxist terrorist groups during the years of Lead in Italy, which was a period of mass political violence where the Soviets sought regime change and also outsourced some of their operations to the STB. Overt examples can be seen in the Brezhnev Doctrine, which existed to justify the Soviet invasions of Hungary in 1956 and of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Another Soviet intervention which fell in line with the Brezhnev Doctrine regarding regime change was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to prop up the failing DRA. As with the internal means, there are a lot of cases of Soviet external regime change upon other states during the Cold War. U.S. support for internal regime changes include the 1952 Egyptian Revolution, the 1954 Guatemalan coup, support for a capitalist restructuring of the post-Greek Civil War government, and U.S. support of groups in the failed state of Libya after Gaddafi's removal. External examples of U.S. regime change are the invasion of Grenada and invasion of Panama. Covert regime change was the case in the 1953 coup of Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh, and an example of overt regime change was the supporting of the Mujahideen against the DRA during Operation Cyclone in the Soviet-Afghan War. An example of coercive diplomacy for the U.S. is Operation Uphold Democracy, where the U.S. threatened to invade Haiti if Raul Cedras didn't step down from power. An intervention by the U.S. regarding regime change was Operation Golden Pheasant in 1988, where paratroopers were deployed in Honduras to force Nicaraguan forces to withdraw from attacking anti-Sandinista rebels who were hiding in Honduras. This was not, American forces planning to overthrow Nicaragua, but rather American forces were being deployed to Honduras to prevent the Nicaraguans from attacking rebels who were against the Nicaraguan government. The Russian Federation had a phase of being involved in immediate regime changes in the post-Soviet era in Central Asia and the Caucasus, but since the growth of Russian revisionism in 2004, the state has been exponentially involved in global regime changes, most notable being in Africa, especially since the start of the post-Global War on Terrorism era in 2021. Examples include the coup belt in West Africa and the widespread use of Russian PMCs to back certain regimes and government factions throughout Africa when a security vacuum presents itself. Of course, these are only a few brief examples, as this video is a simple overview of regime change, and of course regime change goes beyond just the US and USSR during the Cold War, and all of these case studies have more to it than was just said in this simple video. Did you know about the different types of regime change and dual containment before this video? If the desired outcome is regime change, which form is the best for stability purposes? Do you have any foreign policy strategy video suggestions? Feel free to write in the comments below, and thank you for watching.